Imagine a quiet room where two men from completely different worlds meet. On one side sits Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young revolutionary leader of Burkina Faso, dressed in his military fatigues, carrying the aura of defiance, strength, and an unshakable love for Africa. On the other side sits Bishop T.D. One of the most influential Christian voices of our time, wearing his signature suit, radiating wisdom and calm. This is not a stage. There are no flashing lights, no microphones, and no choir in the background. It is just two men, a soldier and a preacher, speaking face to face. What happens next is not just a dialogue, it is a collision of two worlds, and what Traoré says to T.D. Jakes could change the way you see Christianity forever. Traoré begins not with hostility, but with conviction in his voice. He looks straight into the eyes of T.D. Jakes and says, Africa has suffered not only from the colonizers' armies, but also from the colonizers' Bible. For centuries, religion was used as a weapon, first to weaken our spirit, then to enslave our bodies. We were told to close our eyes and pray while our lands, our gold, and our dignity were stolen. Bishop, I ask you, was that true Christianity, or was it something else? There is silence in the room. Jakes listens carefully, his face calm but thoughtful. He does not interrupt. Traoré continues, his tone sharper now. When the missionaries arrived in Africa, they did not come alone. They came before the soldiers. They softened our people with promises of heaven, while Europe took our resources. They taught us that humility meant obedience, that turning the other cheek meant surrendering our land, and that poverty was somehow God's will. But tell me, Bishop, would Christ ever stand on the side of those who oppress? Jakes takes a slow breath, but he still waits. Traoré is not finished. For centuries, our ancestors prayed for deliverance. They prayed in chains during slavery. They prayed in silence during colonization. They prayed while foreign powers built empires on their suffering. And yet, the church, the institution of Christianity, stood silent. Sometimes it even stood with the oppressors. How then can we call this the gospel of liberation? How can we believe that Christ himself would want Africa to remain on its knees? The words hang heavy in the air. Finally, T.D. Jakes speaks. His voice is steady, compassionate, but also firm. He says, Captain, you are right. The church has often failed Africa. It has failed the oppressed. It has allowed empire to use its pulpits, its missionaries, and even its scripture to justify exploitation. And for that, there is no excuse. But let me be clear, Captain. What you reject is not the Christianity of Christ. It is the Christianity of empire. Christ himself was no friend of the powerful. He overturned tables in the temple. He rebuked hypocrites. He stood with the poor, the broken, and the oppressed. The Jesus of Scripture did not bless the empire. He challenged it. If that message was lost in Africa, it was because empire twisted the gospel to serve its own agenda. Traoré leans back, still unsatisfied. He speaks again, this time pointing at modern Africa. Bishop, look around you. Even today, churches in Africa preach prosperity while millions starve. They preach patience while corrupt leaders loot the nation. They build cathedrals worth millions while children cannot afford school. The people are told to wait for heaven while hell is their reality on earth. Tell me, Bishop, is this faith? Or is this another tool of control? Jakes shakes his head now, his voice rising. No, Captain, that is not faith. That is not Christ. Any church that ignores the suffering of its people is not preaching the gospel. Faith without justice is not faith. Preaching without action is not the gospel. If the church in Africa does not rise to defend its people, then it has betrayed Christ. The gospel must be more than words. It must be a weapon for freedom. The two men lock eyes, and for a moment, the clash of ideas is intense. Traoré is relentless. He speaks again. "Bishop, look around you. Even today, churches in Africa preach prosperity, while millions starve. They preach patience, while corrupt leaders loot the nation. They build cathedrals worth millions, while children cannot afford school. The people are told to wait for heaven, while hell is their reality on earth. Tell me, Bishop, is this faith, or is this another tool of control?" There is a pause. Jakes reflects deeply before responding. Christianity belongs wherever Christ belongs, and Christ belongs with the oppressed, with the hungry, with those who fight for justice. He is not European. He is not American. He does not belong to colonizers. He belongs to humanity. The Africa you describe does not need the empire's Christianity. It needs Christ's Christianity. And that, Captain, is a very different thing. The tension begins to soften, but Traoré pushes one step further. His voice is low, but filled with power. If Christianity is to remain in Africa, it must be African. It must reflect our struggle, our dignity, our culture. The Christ we need is not a white figure in stained glass windows. The Christ we need is one who walks with African farmers in the fields, who stands with soldiers at the borders, who cries with mothers who have lost their children to war. The Christ we need understands our suffering and leads us not to submission, but to resistance. This time, Jakes does not argue. His eyes well slightly as he says, "Captain, perhaps that is the Christ we all need. Not a Christ dressed in the robes of empire, but a Christ who walks barefoot with the oppressed. A Christ beyond race, beyond politics, beyond borders. If Africa rediscovers this Christ, then perhaps Africa will not only heal itself, but teach the rest of the world what Christianity truly means." The room falls into silence again. For a moment, neither man speaks. The weight of the conversation is too heavy, too sacred. Then slowly, Traoré stands, extends his hand, and Jakes rises to meet it. Their handshake is not just a gesture. It is a symbol that even in their differences, they have found common ground. As they prepare to part ways, Jakes turns to Traoré with a final reflection. "Captain, your revolution is not only political, it is spiritual. And maybe that is what the world fears most. Not just the liberation of Africa's lands, but the liberation of its soul." And so the meeting ends, but the words linger. What does it mean to believe in Christianity in a land that has been scarred by colonization? What does it mean to follow Christ in Africa? Perhaps it means rejecting the Christianity of empire and rediscovering the Christianity of liberation. Perhaps it means refusing to separate faith from justice. Perhaps it means realizing that Christ does not belong to Europe or to America or to any empire, but to the oppressed, to the poor, and to those who hunger for freedom. What Traoré said to T.D. Jakes was more than a critique. It was a challenge, not only to the church in Africa, but to Christians everywhere. A challenge to stop hiding behind empty rituals and instead live the radical message of Christ: justice for the poor, freedom for the oppressed, and truth in the face of power. And maybe, just maybe, what happened in that room was not the clash of a soldier and a preacher, but the birth of a new way of seeing Christianity, not as a chain, but as a weapon of liberation, not as the religion of colonizers, but as the gospel of freedom. What Traoré said to T.D. Jakes will not be forgotten, because if Africa embraces this vision, it will not only change Africa, but it will change Christianity itself.